So here we are. This is the second lecture on Chapter 4. Chapter 4 is on demand and supply. Last time we talked about demand. Today we're going to talk about supply, and then we're going to put the two together and talk about how markets work. But I've got quite a bit here, actually. It's amazing. We just met 2 days ago, and yet just a lot of news that came out in the last couple of days. So I'm just going to hit the highlights on some of this. Kind of like skipping a stone across a still pond. You know, I'm just going to touch on some things. This is from the business and tech section of the Wall Street Journal. It says shipping sector faces upheaval. Global container volumes are on track for zero growth this year, which could mark the sector's worst performance since the financial collapse of 2009. Just an indication, that's all it is, that world trade has come to almost a standstill, which is an indicator of how well the world is doing economically. Here's another one. Another article here says global trade growth set for post-crisis low. Post-crisis means since the financial collapse of 2007-2008. So it's worse it's been since the great collapse. Here's an article from the Wall Street about the housing bubble. Housing bubbles are inflating in major cities around the world. Now, what do you suppose is causing a housing bubble? With Vancouver and London most at risk, so we're talking about around the world, not just the United States, and the bubble is caused by ultra-low interest rates at global central banks. So because of these ultra-low interest rates, of course, what are a lot of people doing? They're, borrowing money. And one of the things they're borrowing money for are houses. So there's been a great increase in the demand for those high-ticket items because of the low interest rates. But it is a bubble because an increase in interest rates could easily pop that bubble, especially if you have a variable rate interest. A lot of these people are borrowing money on variable rates, meaning that if interest rates go up, their payments go up. So the low interest rates encourage people to come into the market, but interest rates will increase, and they could increase a lot. Remember, in 1979, the lowest interest rate available to anybody was 21%. So if you borrow money, if you're the only reason you borrow money is because of very low interest rates, and you've got a variable rate or a loan that can be called. What does that mean, the loan can be called? Well, bankers can simply demand payment. Banks often do that, even if it's not part of the contract. So anyway, it's a very risky situation. Here's one that says, Japan sees defeat to deflation mindset. In Japan, where prices fell steadily for 15 years, so Japan has been trying to increase prices for 15 years by creating money called quantitative easing. The bank concluded last week that the Japanese citizens generally decide where prices will go based on what they see and not what they're told. Well, amazing. In other words, they're finally seeing through the propaganda, and they're basing their actions on what they see and not what they're told by the government. Quite a revelation. Anyway, Japan is changing. After 15 years, they're finally saying, well, maybe we ought not rely solely on monetary policies to try to solve our problems. And of course, what the low interest rates are doing, in Japan they're negative interest rates, when prices fall, companies are reluctant to borrow money prices of borrowed money, that is. When interest rates fall, companies are reluctant to borrow money to invest, and consumers tend to hang on to cash even though it earns zero interest at the bank. So in other words, people are basing their actions on their expectations. Remember last time I talked about one of the reasons that will cause a shift in demand curve are people's expectations. So if people expect things to get worse, then they, despite the low interest rates, they will be reluctant to borrow because their expectations is a more powerful force in terms of what determines their actions than the low interest rates. Here's one. Judges question scope of EPA's power plant rules. Well, what's happening here is, again, it gets down to the rule of law and the rule of man. And the judges focus much of their questioning on whether the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, had overstepped its legal authority by seeking to broadly compel this shift away from coal. The states and companies suing the EPA argue that the agency doesn't have the authority to regulate anything outside of a power plant itself. In other words, in the past, the Environmental Protection Agency made rules that govern existing power plants. But now the EPA is mandating that power companies build new power plants according to the wishes of the Environmental Protection Agency. In other words, they don't want any coal plants, they don't want any plants that burn oil or even natural gas. They're pushing power companies to build more solar energy and who knows what, I don't know. But anyway, the point is that does the Environmental Protection Agency have the power to mandate companies to build certain types of plants? I mean, that's something brand new. That never happened before. And so the power plant companies are bringing the Environmental Protection Agency to court for a court to decide, well, does the EPA have this authority or not? So, all right, now lastly, this brings me to the video I'm going to show you. Survey finds the national debt to be biggest concern. This is, this is an election year, and we just had a debate, and so there were a lot of surveys taken about, hey, what are your concerns as citizens? And the biggest concern that people said was the national debt. And here is the debt clock. And this tells us that the U.S. national debt is about $19.5 trillion. Now, let me put this in perspective for you. Let's say that I borrowed money from you, and I said that I would pay you back in 1,000,000 seconds. Now, if you got out your calculator or whatever and calculate what that is, that would be 12 days. All right? I borrow $1 million, I'll pay you back in 12 days. That's 1,000,000 seconds. But then I say, well, no, I'm not going to pay you back in 1,000,000 seconds, I'm going to pay you back in 1,000,000,000 seconds. Now, how long would you have to wait? You'd have to wait 32 years. Okay? 1,000,000,000 seconds. Okay? If you count off 1,000,000,000 seconds, it would take 32 years. Then I say, no, really, it's not 1,000,000,000. I made a mistake. I'm going to pay you back in 1,000,000,000,000 seconds. You know how long 1,000,000,000,000 seconds is? 32,000 years. Now think on that. 1,000,000,000 seconds is 32,000 years. And our national debt is $20 trillion. Ain't that amazing? I mean, it's unfathomable. You can't imagine. And under Ronald Reagan, we had something called the Grace Commission, which I talk about in the book. And one of the objectives of this Grace Commission was, the whole point of the Grace Commission was to find out how much money the government was spending, what they were spending it on, what the tax, what taxes were paying for. And what the Grace Commission found is that every penny that Americans spend or pay in federal income tax goes to pay the interest on the national debt. Every penny. Yeah, something. And who's that paid to? It's paid to the central bankers. It's paid to the federal, not only our Federal Reserve. See, our Federal Reserve, according to the charter of the Federal Reserve, Class A stockholders are not revealed. No one knows except themselves who they are. But we do know that about 60% of the stockholders of the Federal Reserve, which is a public corporation, not part of the government, about 60% is owned by foreigners. So what that means is that every penny that Americans pay in federal income tax is paid to the Federal Reserve, which is owned by private individuals, and 60% of them we know are foreigners. You find that interesting? So I've got a video here that's, if you don't know who Ron Paul is, he served in Congress for 22 years, and he talks about the national debt. In fact, one of the books that I highlight in your textbook is a book by Ron Paul called End the Fed, Fed meaning the Federal Reserve. And I'm going to show you about 10 minutes of this video because it's really quite, it's quite interesting.
Jared. The first is that for any American who has money in a U.S. bank account, the stock market, bonds, anywhere in the U.S. dollars, your assets could see a massive collapse in value. But my second concern is perhaps bigger than that and will have dire consequences for every American. You see, as I said, our government is broke. As a result, they're going to take very desperate and even radical measures that might seem unconstitutional in order to save our financial system. In short, Jared, I believe the government could soon enact what I call financial martial law.
Martial law, you mean like using force?
They will try anything they can think of, and I'm sure they'll become creative if they need to be.
It just seems crazy. I mean, how could the government get away with that?
Most people only know about ordinary martial law, which usually happens after a natural disaster or some kind of riot. For example, after Hurricane Katrina, the government sent in the military and National Guard to certain neighborhoods to keep the peace. And as most people know, when martial law goes into effect, all the conventional rules of liberty go out the window. The government sets curfews, decides who's allowed in certain areas, that type of thing. And yes, they use force. Well, financial martial law is a bit different, but it's a heck of a lot scarier. They can literally come in and force you to invest in certain things, because if nobody wants government bonds anymore, and that's going to come, they'll say, well, if you have a retirement fund, you will buy government bonds. Martial law means force. When financial martial law goes into effect, all the financial rules you know about will go out the window. Everything you've earned, saved, invested in, is all fair game for the U.S. government to seize. You think your money is yours and the government can't touch it? Not anymore. The government is going to embark on a money grab, the likes of which we haven't seen in 50 years.
I don't understand. I mean, doesn't something like that completely violate the U.S. Constitution?
Jared, if we see a full-blown currency crisis in this country, we will continue to see significant attacks on the Constitution and your liberties. Remember, the U.S. government will use any means necessary to protect and save the financial system. What I call financial martial law is what happens when the government finds itself in a desperate situation, very much like we're in right now, and decides to radically change the financial rules in order to keep the peace. But I haven't even told you the worst part. Every single time the U.S. government has used financial martial law in the past, it's resulted in huge losses of wealth for individuals like you and me.
But I've already paid my taxes, right? I mean, how can the government just walk up and start grabbing money out of my private account?
To the authoritarians, America's security and future is more important than any single individual, Jared. I've had members of the Fed tell me this personally. They've told me they acknowledge that radical Fed measures often hurt individuals, especially seniors and retirees, but it's just the price we have to pay for the greater good. In a crisis situation, the government will put their hands on your bank account, stock market account, your retirement account, your pension, you name it. Any place you have an asset priced in US dollars, you could ultimately kiss up 80% of it goodbye.
But that seems like a pretty big leap from where we are today.
It's coming, Jared. They'll change the laws on what we can do with your money, how much you can access, and where you can spend it. They might even change the money itself. The people will eventually have to wake up and find out what's going on. When I show you what's being proposed, I think you'll be pretty surprised. American history has shown us many times that when the government needs to save itself, it won't hesitate to steal your money.
So you're saying the government has done this type of thing before, right here in America?
Several times. For example, what if I told you every US dollar you have in the bank right now could one day be worth just a single penny? Look it up in the history books, Jared. In the earliest years of our country, there was a Continental Congress who was as desperate for money as our current government is today. But then there was no Federal Reserve, so they created something called Continentals, bills of credit, or Continentals for short. In essence, they printed money out of thin air. They issued more than $240 million worth of Continentals and then forced it on the people.
What do you mean by force?
Anyone who refused to accept America's new Continental funny money faced stiff penalties. In Virginia, for example, refusing to accept the new currency for an existing debt amounted to a cancellation of that debt. And you can probably guess what happened. The money was so inflated, the exchange rate fell from 1 Continental per silver dollar to 40 to 1 and then 75 to 1 in little more than a year. Ultimately, Continentals fell 99% in value in just a few years, and the federal government reneged on their promise to pay Continentals with precious metals. So anyone left holding this worthless currency was entitled to receive just a penny for every dollar, a near total destruction of wealth.
All right, but wait, Dr. Paul, that was a long, long time ago. I mean, before our current government even existed. I mean, they wouldn't do something like that now, would they?
No, it happened over and over in 1971, 1933. It even happened with one of the most trusted U.S. presidents in history. President Lincoln created a system whereby the government changed the rules of finance. It's a sad story, actually. They created a new type of paper money known as greenbacks, specifically to pay soldiers in government debt. Meanwhile, the government itself didn't touch greenbacks, but they demanded taxes to be paid in silver and gold coins.
So a double standard.
Double standard for sure, and the new money plummeted in value, dropping 66% over several years. It took U.S. soldiers 15 years before they could ultimately redeem their greenbacks for an equivalent value of gold.
Yeah, but still, again, that was during the Civil War, right? So before America was the most powerful country in the world.
Yes, it was, but I hope you're starting to see a pattern here, Jared. Broke and desperate governments do truly desperate things. For example, what if I told you the government might put out a recall on your money, forcing you to turn it into federal banking facilities in exchange for something less valuable?
I don't know, that sounds something like you would see in China or Russia, but not here.
Well, Franklin Delano Roosevelt did exactly that when he gave Americans just 1 month to turn in all their gold bullion, common gold coins, and gold certificates to any member bank of the Federal Reserve System.
Is that what actually happened?
Look it up in the history books, Jared. 1933. Anyone who failed to comply faced penalties including forfeiture, fines, and imprisonment. And here's the worst part. Once everyone turned in all their gold, Roosevelt instantly made the dollars they received less valuable. With the stroke of a pen, many Americans lost 41% of their savings overnight. People don't believe anything like this could happen today, but I'm telling you, it's coming. The U.S. government will use financial martial law.
So is there anything that people could have done back then to protect themselves?
For most people, no, it was a disaster, but some did, sure. There's a famous story of a lawyer named Harold Beresford. For instance, he found a legal way to hold on to and accumulate even more gold during the FDR era. His holdings reportedly sold years later for something like 87 times his money.
Okay, so the government destroyed the currency in the 1700s, the 1800s, and then again in the early 1900s. And at each turn, they implemented all kinds of schemes and laws to essentially steal money from regular citizens like you and me. But again, could it really happen?
Not only will it happen again, but we're still feeling the effects of the last time it happened with Nixon. Remember, in 1971, when countries around the world lost faith in the dollar, President Nixon changed the rules overnight. He closed the gold window and decreed that dollars were no longer redeemable for gold.
Well, fine, but that was 45 years ago.
The damage is still being felt. You see, ending the tide to precious metals allowed the government to expand the money supply. And as I've said many times in my career in the House of Representatives, you can't create prosperity by printing money out of thin air. Ever since Nixon changed the rules, the value of the U.S. dollar has plummeted, Jared. Not to mention, it ushered in one of the worst decades in financial history. Inflation soared by more than 100%. Unemployment went above 10%. Stocks fell 40% in a single 18-month period. And the Standard & Poor's 500 fell as much as 45% in the first part of the decade. And interest rates ultimately soared to nearly 20%, which made it very difficult for people to buy new houses or cars.
Okay, but what could the government realistically do next? What would financial martial law look like in this day and age?
The next step is very simple. They're going to take control of U.S. retirement accounts. It could be one of the biggest encroachments in our nation's history, but I think the chances are great that the U.S. government will soon target ordinary Americans' retirement accounts and essentially siphon out the money.
But how can they do that? That's got to be illegal.
Because they act outside the law. Somebody says, would that be unconstitutional? Obviously, well, the monetary system is unconstitutional. They never repaired the part of the Constitution where the founders were emphatic. Only gold and silver can be legal tender. They just totally ignore it. And every time a case like that has gone to the courts, the court always rules on the side of government.
It just seems crazy. I mean, how could the government get away with that?
Jared, today there's about $23 trillion in U.S. retirement accounts. Suppose the government mandates that all citizens put 1/3 of these accounts into special issue U.S. Treasury securities. Well, lo and behold, that's an instant $7 trillion for the government.
There's no way. I mean, you're saying the government can force me to buy worthless treasury bonds?
It's as legal as taxing you. You have to understand that $23 trillion just sitting around in retirement accounts is too much money for a desperate and broke government to ignore. And let me tell you something. If you don't think this can happen right here in America, wake up. It's already being discussed. In 2008, Democrats talked about seizing private retirement accounts and converting them to accounts managed by Social Security. In 2013, the U.S. Consumer Financial Protection Bureau considered helping Americans manage their retirement accounts. And even Forbes.com contributor William Tucker suggested this could lead to forcing Americans to stock their retirement accounts with low-return government bonds. Not to mention, Obama recently introduced his MyRA program, which amounts to an IRA that invests directly in government bonds any reasonable investor on the open market wouldn't touch. I worked in Washington for over 30 years, Jared. Believe me, I know what these people are capable of, and I know how they think.
Well, y'all find that interesting? Now you know why they call economics a dismal science, right? The Federal Reserve, first of all, it's unconstitutional because the Constitution says that only the government will control money, and money is in terms of gold and silver. And so our money supply is not under our government at all. It's under a private organization. an international organization at that. Also, the 16th Amendment, which established the Federal Reserve in 1913, is illegal because it was never ratified by the states, which, according to the Constitution, to change it it requires ratification by the states to change the Constitution, but the 16th Amendment was never ratified. So, you find that interesting? And another thing, what is the difference between Austrian economics? One difference between Austrians and Keynesians. Well, the difference is that Keynesians depend on planning. What Frederick Hayek warned us against in his books is that he warned us against planning. His book, The Road to Serfdom. Well, what is the road that leads us to serfdom? Well, the road is planning. It's a planned system that leads to a loss of personal freedom and eventually a collapse of the economy as well. And if you have a plan, then how do you convince people to cooperate in that plan? Well, there's two ways. Number one is propaganda, and number two is force. Yeah.
Say the financial martial law happens and they attack retirement funds and they pay off a third of the national debt. Say that happens, wouldn't that alleviate some of the financial stress we're under and people can get money back quicker?
Well, you're assuming that they would pay off the national debt. I don't think that's.
Well, it was saying
Well, that our government's broke, period, so it needs ever more money. That's why some of these articles I have here, I didn't go into, but lately there's been a slew of penalties. Banks have paid huge penalties. Volkswagen, had to pay $40 billion. Deutsche Bank, a German bank, was just fined by American government, and a lot of this is simply a money grab because the government simply needs money to pay its obligations. It can't pay its obligations. Especially if you consider its unfunded liabilities, where it made mandates to spend X amount of money, but it's got no way of funding those mandates. That's called an unfunded liability. And plus, what's happened is that our growth has declined. We're not growing as we normally would in the recovery, and that growth simply means less revenue for the government. Plus the fact that half Americans are receiving more payments from the government than they're paying in taxes. So, you put all those things together and you've got an impossible situation. Well, any other questions? Yeah.
Can you save your money or whatever if you had it in a different country on their currency?
Well, that's what a lot of people are doing. Yes, a lot of people are but that brings us to FATCA. FATCA stands for the Foreign Account Tax Compliance Act. And because so many people were trying to store their money in foreign countries, FATCA requires that all American citizens, or people who could be considered a citizen, even someone who's never even been to America, but maybe for some reason they can be considered a citizen, have to be compliant with American tax laws, and they have to file an income tax form. So you can be born in another country, never step foot in America, never earn any income in America, and yet you are required to fill out every year a tax form. And if you don't, if you have an account with a foreign bank, and this is anywhere in the world, if an American has an account with a foreign bank, and that bank does not divulge all of your financial information to the Federal Reserve, then the federal government says that they will withhold 30% of any monies leaving America and going into that bank. So foreign banks now are shunning Americans. If you're an American, it's hard to get almost impossible to get a bank account in a foreign country, because foreign banks are saying there's too much paperwork here, there's too much risk involved, it's not worth it, and they're telling Americans to take their money elsewhere. Find that interesting? Yeah.
So if I understand you correctly, the more Indian tax money you have, the better off you are. They'll bury it in your backyard somewhere.
Well, that's assuming that they don't outlaw currency. And that's the direction we're headed toward. I mean, in the short run, that would be a good plan. In the short run, if there's a bank collapse and you've got, a couple $1,000s of cash, at least that money will still be good, and that will see you over, a short period of time. But eventually, they're going to outlaw cash.
When you say things like that, it kind of makes me anxious, because that's not going to happen in the next year, will it?
Well, I don't think the next year, no. Tomorrow, this is the 28th. In 2 days, the International Monetary Fund issues a brand new world currency, a special drawing right. It's made up of 5 currencies, 40% of which, America, the dollar is one of the 5, and in fact the dollar is actually going to be 40% of the initial offering. But we're moving toward a world currency.
Well, I'm a server, so the majority of my money that I make cash in here. So that kind of makes me like really anxious. I know
Yeah.
there are other professions that
Because eventually it'll be all virtual money. I mean, that's where we're headed toward. They'll outlaw currency, and everyone. See, if they can eliminate currency, and so the only money available to us is virtual money, then the government has total control over our lives, really. And that's really the direction we're headed. Now, when that's going to happen, I don't know, but that's the momentum is heading in that direction.
there will be some sort of warning before that happens, right? I mean, it's not just
Well, I'm giving you warning. That's what Ron Paul was doing.
It's like the majority of my money is in a lockbox at my house.
Uh-huh.
So
That's a good.
I have a bank account, don't get me wrong.
Yeah. Well, I think everyone should have if possible, you should have a currency that dollars that you just keep somewhere, like in a box for such emergencies.
My father is the same way. He literally lives in the backyard.
Yeah. And that is a good thing to do in the short run, but not in the long run. Yeah.
So, doesn't it make sense just to not save money then? If this is gonna happen, just spend what you got?
Well, that's what people are doing. People are not saving with zero negative interest rates. People are not saving. See, here's the point. If people aren't saving because of all that we're talking about and low and negative interest rates, then where is the money coming from that's being normally we would put money in the bank, and then bank would take that money and lend it out. But if we're not putting money in the bank, then where's that money coming from? Well, it's being created. For the past, 5 years, we've been creating about $80 billion a month of new currency. So instead of people working and then saving a part of the money and depositing that money in the bank, to replace that, we're simply replacing it with newly created money out of thin air.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How are the standards of that money then, like, for the dollar, we have standards for, like, how much it's worth, so how are they gonna judge that if it's all virtual?
Well, money is only worth what it can buy. Money, the value of money is determined by the level of inflation. The more inflation, the less the value of the money.
Kind of have to think abstractly about money. The money that you have in your pocket right now is not money, it's currency.
Yeah.
It's backed by absolutely nothing.
Right.
Money is kind of defined as anything with intrinsic value.
Mhm.
So, best way to do it is try to find things that are actually have intrinsic value. Like
Yeah.
gold and silver, even goods, as guns, anything. That
Yeah.
stuff is actually has value.
Yeah, yeah, well, that's an excellent answer. That would be, anything of concrete value, you know, would be a good way to go, you know,
We did have
land.
money at one time, but we really don't now.
The what now?
Look on the top of it, Federal Reserve note. It means absolutely nothing.
Yeah, well, it's an IOU.
IOU.
It's a debt. The only way currency comes into existence is through debt. Yeah,
Okay, so, I don't know.
yeah, I know,
If
it's
they
tough.
outlaw money and you still
Well, not
have
money,
dollar-
currency,
Excuse me, currency.
yeah,
If they outlaw currency and you still have dollar bills,
yeah.
does that mean they're just gonna round them all up and burn them?
Well, they
Well,
just
I
wouldn't
feel
be
like
worth
this
anything.
happens.
I mean, it's just like, you know, during the Civil War, the South had their own currency, but when the South lost the war, that currency became worthless. They're just pieces of paper.
I feel like if this happens, there are people who rely strictly on money.
You mean currency?
Currency.
Yeah.
Excuse me, there are people who strictly rely on dollar bills.
Yeah, dollar bills.
Supplies,
Yeah, right.
whatever.
That's
Like,
currency.
whether it be legal or illegal, I
Yeah.
feel like if this happens, currency itself, although it's not accepted by the government, will still be used by the common people. Like, there is no
Well,
way
it's
to-
possible, yeah. I mean, you're making a good point. I mean, a currency that has value is anything people are willing to accept in payment. I mean, if two people agree on something, then they agree to it.
Like, is there
I mean,
any sort of-
that's where it is now, right? I mean, when you go to the store, you can pay in cash because the store owner says, well, I accept this in payment of this good or service. So it's an agreement between two people. So, I mean, you're absolutely right. As long as people, but the problem though is that if the government makes it illegal, then you're into a different situation. See, the government can make it illegal, like under Roosevelt, things like this happened. You know, gold, it was illegal to have gold. You could be sent to prison if you had gold or silver. You had to turn all that into the government. I mean, that's what happened. That's what Ron Paul was talking about. And he was talking about in Virginia at that time is that if you failed to turn in your gold and silver, you would lose everything you have. See, what you're saying would be true unless they passed a law making it illegal, which they very well could, because if their intention is to eliminate currency, then they will make it illegal. That, yeah, you know, people, you could find people to accept it, but you could be put in prison for so doing.
I feel like that it would be definitely kind of like because they're accepting people who rely strictly on
Yeah.
itself. That's probably
Oh, yeah,
the majority of the people I know, and there's no, we already have 40 years.
yeah,
You have to think that the only thing that's people wanting money is because you know you can take that dollar, you can take it to any store around here, and you can buy whatever you want. Okay, now, so think about it this way, the government says it's illegal, stores are like, okay, that's it. And then it trickles right down to everybody else.
Yeah.
So, if something like that happens, then we would definitely put it in the business. So the electronic money he's talking about,
Yeah.
you wouldn't have any physical currency with it.
yeah.
And that's how it would work. It would be kind of a slow thing, but We've been building.
Yeah, it's slow. These things don't often happen overnight, although when they change a law, it can happen overnight, yeah.
For some reason, like, somebody would see illegalities of things like what is impacting to drug trade or gun money or things like that. Like, how
Well,
is
we
that?
definitely live in
I mean, there's gonna be a way, there's always a way around it, like, they're gonna go with the scanners, you get your card, and like, just like, I want my weed from this guy, like, alright, scan it, goes from illegal.
Yeah,
accounts,
our
same
technology is
thing.
making it very hard to hide anything. Yeah, Mike, you have it?
Yeah, so if they do, eliminate currency and make it illegal to have, like, all the currency that we have, how would we gain the value with the virtual money? Like, how would we earn the money virtually instead of?
Oh, well, that's the way, I mean, it is now. I mean, I get paid. I don't get paid in currency. My bank account is credited every, 2 weeks. That's virtual money. And then I have a debit card and I can use, I use my debit card and I go to, I mean, that's virtual money. There's nothing physical there. So it's already happened.
Is that virtual money or is it virtual currency?
Money has a different.
No, it's not currency. It's not currency. Currency is, by the definition of currency, is something tangible. I mean, like a dollar bill is
So
currency.
would the card be currency?
See, money can be intangible, but currency is tangible. Dollar bills that you can feel and touch and smell is currency. And currency is money, the way we use it now, but money doesn't have to be physical. But then we call it money, we don't call it currency. It's just definition, that's all.
So what about Bitcoin? How is that?
Well, now Bitcoin, and I've talked about that before, the reason why Bitcoin is becoming more and more popular, and it is, online now, I see more online retailers accepting Bitcoin as payment, and the advantage of Bitcoin is that there is a prescribed way that Bitcoin can come into existence, and only a certain amount can come into existence over a period of time. And therefore, you know that the value is going to be maintained. Because what diminishes the value is when the money is created willy-nilly. See, with official money, not only in America, but other countries like the European Central Bank and the Japanese Central Bank, they are creating money, a lot of money, just out of thin air. And that devalue, that lowers the value of that money. And therefore, people are saying, I want something that's going to maintain its value, and that's where Bitcoin comes in. Yeah.
As far as Bitcoin, so are you saying the volatility of Bitcoin is just temporary? Because it shot up to 1,000, burst, and then dropped down.
Well, the value of Bitcoin is all determined by, the demand and supply, which is something we're going to talk about, in this chapter. But only a certain amount can come into existence every year. See, dollars can be now our government has no control over our money supply, first of all. Okay, our money supply is controlled 100% by the Federal Reserve, which is not a part of our government. But they can increase but the federal government sells bonds to the Federal Reserve, and then the Federal Reserve creates money to buy those bonds. That's how new money comes into existence. Whereas with Bitcoin, that doesn't happen. It only a certain amount can come into existence at any one time, according to a set schedule.
Why can't they do that with the dollar then? Stop making it and just put it on a set schedule, a certain amount.
Oh, well, they can, I mean, if the government controlled our money, that's what probably would happen. But our money's not controlled by our government, it's controlled by central bankers.
Central bankers, I mean, eventually, they're gonna see the effect of what's going on, so wouldn't it be-
No, because they want control, and control comes by devaluing the currency, by driving people into debt, and then when the economy collapses, they gain control of more physical things. So what's happening is all planned, according to the central bankers.
So, if I wanted to sit and talk about all of this, because what I'm taking away from this is that it's not smart to have a currency. And if I wanna stay on top of all of this, do I keep my currency, do I put it all in the bank? Do I exchange it out for Bitcoin or this world dollar if that's a big cost? Or do I buy something more tangible, like goods or services?
Well, yeah, I mean, I would keep the currency. I mean, these things aren't gonna happen overnight, and even if they did, you know, people are very habitual, and we have been programmed to accept dollars as payment for, you know, yeah, so that, I mean, those habits are gonna be hard to break no matter what happens. So, yeah, I would say, you know, I mean, don't panic, I mean, just live your life, but it would be a good idea to, you know, maybe have some currency, just like it'd be a good idea to have some dried food or canned food, you know, extra around.
Guns and bullets.
And maybe that too. I don't wanna say that on, you know, on tape, on video. I gotta be careful what I say.
Because that seems like the only rational thing to invest in.
Yeah, well, a lot of people are doing that. A lot of people are, you know, are doing that, yeah. I mean, it'd be a good idea that, you know, to have bottled water and stuff like that.
But like I said, like, I'm tired of it because the currency itself, and you take that away, you have literally have nothing at all. Well, not nothing, but
Well, I mean,
majority of my finances is just.
yeah. Well, you know, the whole notion of having waitresses and waiters is becoming obsolete. I mean, you know, like Panera Bread is doing away with all their, you know, they don't have any waitresses. I mean, everything is electronic. And that's the direction we're headed. Well, I better get going with this chapter. Let's see. Didn't mean to spend this much time, but I think it's great that y'all are interested. All right, well, I'm starting with this slide here on demand. It'll just be one slide. It's a slideshow from current slide. When price changes, the curve itself does not change, either demand or supply. Now, what has to happen in order for a demand curve to either shift to the right or shift to the left? Well, something has to change other than price. Things we call a non-price determinant, things that determine price, but things that can change the demand curve are non-price determinants. Well, what are these non-price determinants? Well, the more people in the market, then there's a tendency for demand to increase. The fewer people in a market, then there's a tendency for demand to decrease, meaning the whole curve will either shift to the right or shift to the left. If consumers' incomes change, now if I say income, I mean real income, not money income. If people's incomes change, if people's incomes increase, there'll be a tendency for demand to, the whole curve to shift to the right. If real incomes decrease, then aggregate demand will shift to the left. Prices of related goods can change. Now notice we're not talking about the good in question, we're not talking about the price of that changing, but if the price of something that's related is either being a complement or a substitute, that can cause a shift in the demand for, you know, the good in question. Consumer expectations can change. And with those change in expectations, their demand curves can shift to the right or shift to the left. And demographics can change, you know, meaning the environment. Or consumer tastes and preferences can change for maybe no reason or for some good reason, but for whatever the reason, that can cause a shift in the whole curve. All right. Now, what we're going to see here is the same thing holds with supply curve, but there's some of the reasons that will cause shifts in supply curves are different. So, what is supply? A relation showing the quantities of goods producers are willing and able to sell at various prices during a given time period, other things constant. Notice this is the same definition of demand, except we're talking about supply, and so we're talking about sellers, producers, and not about consumers. And a supply curve shows quantities of a good supplied at various prices, other things constant. Okay. Again, same definition, except we're talking about supply. So what is the law of supply? The quantity of a product supplied at any time period is usually directly related to its price, other things constant. Now, directly related means that if one goes up, the other goes up. With demand curves, we had an inverse relationship between price and quantity. Price went up, quantity demand went down, and vice versa. But with supply, as price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up. Now, to understand that, you have to have a split personality. In other words, when you're looking at the demand curve, who are you? Well, you're the group that's doing the demanding. All right. Now you might say, well, that's the consumer, but it's not always consumer. Like, what group demands labor? Business demands labor, correct? So business would be the demand, and people looking for work would be the supply. All right. So, but the demand curve is the group that's doing the demanding. The supply is the group that's doing the supplying, whatever that is. Like, you all supply labor. Okay. So you are the suppliers of labor. Business is the demanders of labor. Okay. So why is there a direct relationship between price and quantity with supply? Because when price goes up, the supplier gains. Okay, the higher the price goes, then the more the supplier gains, and therefore the supplier has an incentive, and the key word here is incentive. The supplier has an incentive to increase the quantity supplied, because you can make more money, meaning in real terms, as price goes up. Now, how do we know that? How do we know 100% with certainty that if the price goes up, the supplier will make more money? And we can say that because we always make the assumption that when price changes, everything else stays the same. It's called ceteris paribus. It's a Latin term, which means that everything else being equal, nothing else changes. So if you were the supplier of something, and the market is dictating a higher price of whatever it is you're supplying, and nothing else changes, then can you make more money? Yes. And because you're in business to make money, not only make money, but you want to maximize your return, then you're going to gravitate toward suppliers are going to gravitate toward those things where the prices is increasing. So when price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up. There's a direct relationship between price and quantity when you're looking at the supply curve. So the key here is to have a split personality. You're looking at demand, you're looking at the group that's doing the demanding. If you're looking at supply, totally different group. You're looking at the group that's doing supplying. Okay, now we're going to put the two together, after we talk about supply, because the market is made up of demanders and suppliers. See, what is the change in quantity supplied? A movement along supply curve in response to a change in price, other things constant. See, it's always other things constant. When we change price, we always assume that other things are constant, or that nothing else changes other than a change in price. So otherwise, we could not really come to any definitive conclusions. But because we make this assumption, we can come to some concrete conclusions. So when price goes up, the quantity supplied goes up. not supply. I didn't say supply goes up. The supply doesn't change when price changes. What does change is a change in the quantity supplied is measured down on the horizontal axis, because price is always on the vertical axis, quantity is always on the horizontal axis. And so here we have a supply schedule which shows that, see, if the price goes down, what happens to the quantity supplied? It goes down. How come? Well, the key word is incentive. Suppliers have less incentive to supply as price goes down. Why? Because they're making less money. How do we know that? Because we're assuming everything else is the same, and the only thing that's changing is the price. So if the price goes down, the supplier is going to make less money, and therefore has less incentive to supply. Does that make sense?
So if the price goes up, wouldn't the incentive be to lower the prices that more quantity?
Well, now you're talking about the market. See, we're not talking about the market yet. We haven't put the two together. We're simply looking at the supply curve. It's only half the picture. And now, before I can explain what will cause a shift in supply curves, we have to backtrack a little bit to make some definitions, understand some definitions. And one definition is, what is a relevant resource? Resources used to produce the good in question. In other words, a relevant resource for a farmer would be like the price of feed, or hay, or fencing, or tractors. You know, those are relevant resources for a farmer. But if you take like an automobile company, well, the relevant resources for an automobile company would not be the same as those for a farmer. You know, they would be, you know, the price of steel and you know, buildings, and you see so a relevant resource simply means that if you have a business, what resources are relevant to your particular business? That's called a relevant resource. Now, alternative goods, other goods that use some of the same types of resources to produce the good in question. In other words, if you're a farmer and you own 100 acres of land, then you can grow corn on all that 100 acres, or you can grow cabbage on some of those acreages, or you can grow carrots, but all these things are called alternative goods. I mean, you know, you can do this or you can do that given your resources. And whatever this and that is called alternative goods. Again, it's just definition. Now, important, know the difference between a change in the quantity supplied and a change in supply. A change in the quantity supplied occurs when price changes. A change in supply occurs when something other than price changes. Things we call non-price determinants. And so a change in supply means that the whole curve shifts. And so what are some of these non-price determinants for supply curves? Well, here I gave you 6 for demand curves. I'm giving you 5 for supply curves. Technology can change. I mean, what has happened to the supply of iPhones, cell phones, over the past 10 years? Well, supply has increased. Why? Because that's new technology. What's happened to the supply of landline phones? Raise your hand if you got a landline phone. Well, I don't. I'll put my hand down. I haven't had a landline phone for a long time. And so why? Well, because technology's changed, right? I mean, who would ever think that landline phones would become antiques? You know, we all use cell phones nowadays. So a change in technology can cause a shift in supply curves. You know, typewriters is no longer supplied, whereas, you know, other, you know, computers have supply has shifted to the right over the years. Prices of relevant resources. Well, this is the same as with demand curves. If Like take a farmer, for example. If a farmer can decide what to plant on his 100 acres. So if the price of a relevant resource, like let's say take a cattle farmer. If the price of hay goes way up, what's going to happen to the supply of cattle? It's going to go down, right? If the price of a relevant resource, something that the farmer needs, if that goes up, that's going to affect the change in supply. If the price of relevant resources go up, then pretty soon it's not going to become profitable to raise cattle, at least not as many cattle, and therefore the supply goes down. Well, again, you're talking about markets. You know, wait till we get to markets.
I just have questions.
Yeah, it's just supply now. You know, it's just supply. Prices of alternative goods, like a farmer, for example, if the price of wheat goes up or price of corn goes up, then a farmer makes a decision what to plant in the spring, and he often looks at last year. Now, if last year the price of corn was going way up, then a lot of farmers say, well, I'll plant more corn this year. Because he could plant corn or cabbage, but if the price of cabbage went down last year and the price of corn went up, then he'll tend to plant more corn, which would be exactly the wrong thing to do, right? Because when we put the two together and we look at the market, if all farmers are planting more corn this year because the price went up last year, supply shifts to the right and price goes down. So a farmer that understands markets would look at last year and say, well, the price of cabbage went down last year, so this would be a good time to plant cabbage. The price of corn went up last year, so I'm not going to plant corn this year. But most farmers don't do that. Most farmers look at last year and they just, they base a decision. If the price of corn went up last year, they'll plant more corn. And they make that same mistake year after year after year. Just like our monetary authorities, right? They make the same mistake year after, like Japan, they keep doing the same thing year after year after year, and they keep getting the same bad results. Producer expectations can change. Of course, anything can change people's expectations, and whatever it is, it can shift supply curves. And the number of producers, well, the more producers in the market, then there's a tendency for supply to increase. The fewer producers in the market, then there's a tendency for supply to decrease. Now here's when we put the two together, and when we put the two together, we get what is called an equilibrium. The equilibrium means a tendency toward. And a disequilibrium means that we're not at equilibrium. Now, I'm going to have to show you a picture here. We're running out of time, but here, this really explains the whole thing. Okay, we've got a downward sloping demand curve, upward sloping supply curve, and I'm going to show you that the equilibrium is at 75 cents. Why? How do we prove that 75 cents is an equilibrium? Well, in order to prove it, you have to move away from it. And once you move away from it, if there's a tendency to move back toward it, then you know that place is an equilibrium. So let's do that. Now 75 cents is where the quantity demand equals quantity supply. So if we go above 75 cents, see, what are demanders going to say? Well, with the price going up, demanders are going to say, we don't want to buy as much. But what do suppliers say as the price goes up? Well, suppliers are going to say, we want to supply more. So with suppliers supplying more and demanders demanding less, we get surplus. We get the quantity supplied is greater than the quantity demanded. And when companies have a surplus, they're going to cut back production, and if that doesn't work, they're going to lower price in order to get rid of the surplus. You know, companies don't want surpluses. They don't want to pay for something that they produce and then lose all that money. They've got to sell it to get their money back. So they're going to lower the price in order to sell it when there's a surplus. Now, price can fall below 75 cents, and it's not going to stop at 75 cents. We live in life is not static. So it's going to fall, it could fall below 75 cents. Now, if price goes below 75 cents, like let's say 50 cents, what happens when price goes down? Well, suppliers say to themselves, we don't want to supply as much. But demanders say, we want more. Well, with demanders wanting more and suppliers supplying less, then we're going to have a shortage. Now, when we have a shortage, how does the free market decide who gets and who doesn't get? Well, it's the highest bidder. It's like at an auction. The highest bidders get and everyone else doesn't get. So people bid against one another, just like at an auction, and they bid the price up to determine who gets and who doesn't get. And so price goes back up towards 75 cents. So I've proven that 75 cents is an equilibrium, or it would be, this is what would be the market price, because if you go above 75 cents, price goes down. If you go below 75 cents, price goes up. So we're tending toward, in this case, in this picture, 75 cents. 75 cents is the equilibrium price, which would ultimately determine the market price. So what causes an increase in the equilibrium price? Well, here, see, if you have an increase in demand from D to D prime, what happens to price? Equilibrium price goes up, because equilibrium is the supply and demand equals supply, and the equilibrium quantity goes up. And here, for example, if you have a decrease in supply from S to S prime, the equilibrium price will go down and equilibrium quantity will go down. And here, again, more scenarios. We have a decrease in demand, fall in price, fall in quantity demanded. And here, an increase in supply causes a fall in price and an increase in quantity. Now, you may have questions on the test like this. And to get those questions right, you don't have to know anything, except you have to have a third grade ability to draw, all right? If you can draw a straight line, you can get all these questions right. Because if the question says, what happens when aggregate supply shifts to the right, what do you got to do? Well, just draw a piece of paper, downward sloping demand, upward sloping supply, shift the supply to the right, and the answer jumps off the page and hits you right in the face, all right? It's that easy. Y'all with me on this? Well, you don't even have to think, all right? Yeah. So, now, if you have a situation where let's say demand increases a lot and supply increases a little, then don't let that throw you. Don't get confused, because if demand increases more than supply increases, that's the result is the same thing as if demand increases. Y'all with me on this? You know, if supply increases a little bit, demand increases a lot, it's the same thing. The result is it's demand increase, period. So there might be some questions like that on the test. And same with this, all right? So I'm kind of rushing through this now. What is a price floor? I got just a few minutes here, if you bear with me. A minimum legal price below which a good or service cannot be sold. For example, the minimum wage. Or would it be a good idea for a law to increase the minimum wage? I ask you a question, and what comes out of your mouth? Well, that all depends. See, almost all questions can be answered in economics by prefacing it by that all depends. But if the government passes a minimum wage law, and that minimum wage law is greater than the equilibrium wage, then what has to result? A surplus. Now, a surplus of what? A surplus of labor. See, this is the demand for labor, and this is the supply for labor. So if the minimum wage is greater than the equilibrium wage, and the equilibrium wage is not the same for the whole country. The equilibrium wage in New River Valley would be totally different than the equilibrium wage in New York City, all right? But whatever the equilibrium wage is in that locality, if the minimum wage is greater than the equilibrium wage, then you are going to get more unemployment. That's just mathematics, all right? Now, if the minimum wage is less than the equilibrium wage, then people simply get more money, and we're not going to get any more unemployment. Okay, so it all depends. Is the minimum wage a good idea? That all depends. It depends on what? It depends on what that minimum wage law states relative to the equilibrium wage. Now that's just airtight. There's no argument there. That's just mathematics. Okay. Well, I don't have time. A price ceiling would be like rent control. And if the government mandates a price lower than the equilibrium, then we're going to get a shortage. Like rent control, if rent control mandates lower rents than the equilibrium rent, then we're going to get a shortage, because with the price being less than the equilibrium rent, for example, renters are going to say, we want more rental property. Suppliers of rental property are going to say, well, we don't want to supply as much, and so you're going to get a shortage. So everywhere where you have rent control and those rents are less than the equilibrium rent, then you always end up with a shortage. Okay. All right. Well, that I'm pretty close. See, I did pretty good, right? So read chapter 5 for next time, and I'll see you all next time.